David Woollam is a KZN boy to the core, and I suppose more than anyone else, he's been waving the flag about KwaZulu-Natal's iconic industrial corporation, Tongaat Hulett. He tried his best to warn people that it needed to be saved, and well, we now found out this week that nothing's going to be happening on that side. We're going to talk through what could occur next, whether there are ever going to be people held accountable, and indeed who the new Vision Consortium is about. David Woollam is a chartered accountant and a well-known banker in South Africa. I think actually we should start with you, because people are saying, who the hell is this guy? Why should he be telling us all about Tongaat Hulett? What's your connection to the company, Dave?
Well, Alec, no formal connection at all. A lot of people do wonder, how do I have a view about any of these things when I haven't worked in the sugar industry? I've got no direct connection with Tongaat. But there is a distant connection. My father-in-law, father of my wife, was the CEO of Tongaat for many years, way back. He worked for the company from the 50s all the way to the early 90s. He became the CEO, was very close together with Chris Saunders and the team that had really built Tongaat up to a very successful, iconic company. But he retired in the very early 90s, and he's still alive and well. He's 97, an extraordinary man, but he has no involvement in the company at all. I'm an analyst, ex-banker, became an analyst, I would guess, to pursue my investment strategies. I figured I can't compete with the big guys, so I could go and do deep dives, and that's what I do. And I just picked up Tongaat one day, and it just worried me what I saw. I'd seen some reports come out, an Anthony Geard report, some noise, and it just, I guess I'm a very curious person, and I kind of went all in. And 7 years later, sad reflection, I haven't really done anything that's resulted in any good outcomes. And I guess that's something I do reflect on. It's like I wish I'd had more of a positive effect in this process.
But how would have that been possible? You went to the board. You did, from many conversations we've had over the years, you did about as much as was humanly possible. And I think Chris Logan was also waving some flags at some point in time. But it seemed as though nobody was listening.
Yeah, look, I think we did try really hard to engage. We always tried to maintain a position of independence. Myself and a few partners that Charles Liasides, who's one of the biggest shareholders in Tongaat through his company, we always tried to maintain independence. We tried not to take a position or take a stand or try and manipulate the process. Our view was always, how do we get the best people around the table to get the best solution? And sadly, we really just, our voice fell on deaf ears, and there became initially a lot of defensive actions, people, I think, trying to defend their position, and then it became very adversarial. And we can talk later about the role of the industry broader and the players that got involved, but it became very adversarial, and I think that would be the key word that would describe for me why we never got to a solution. Too many people just try to dominate the situation and too much saber rattling rather than just trying to find a solution that really is going to protect the entire north coast of KZN.
I had an email yesterday from Warren Klulo, who you may recall, who was the CEO of Barlow's, which then became Barlow World, and it was a giant in South Africa, and it's now also disappeared, owned by a management buyout. They basically have the Caterpillar franchise, and that's it. And he was bemoaning the lack of leadership in the same way that David Shapiro has bemoaned the lack of leadership. And in this case, is that one of the things that comes to you, that perhaps different leadership, different approaches, Tongaat Hulett might still be employing people, creating jobs, thriving, or helping the province to thrive?
Yeah, I think it's a problem that's endemic across South Africa. We live in an incredibly complicated society right now, and there are winds that are buffeting people from every which way. But I think there are those that stand up to those wins and, I guess, plant themselves firmly and maintain their strong foundational values. And there are others that will tend to be blown with those wins and either panic or use convenience as a justification for certain actions. So I think governance has really failed in South Africa at a government level and at a corporate level. I think we've had a lot of complexity. We've become a very difficult investment destination, but those are all excuses. There are companies that thrive, and there are examples that have shown to be able to navigate through these very complicated situations. So I think Tongaat certainly got controlled by a very dominant leader, Peter Stoudy, a very compliant board or collaborative board. They didn't ask the right questions. A lot of people were duped. And to be honest, there's still a big question in my mind is how were they duped? How do you rack up 12 billion of debt with no profits to underpin that? And then you write off 10 billion of assets. It is so obvious. It's nothing elaborate as Marcus Jooste at Steinhoff. This was such elementary stuff. So I guess it has been a failure of governance, and it's something that really does worry me.
So let's start off with those who should have been blowing the whistle right at the beginning, the accountants, the auditors. You've just pointed out that there were billions that were written off. There were billions in debt that was racked up for the company. And Deloitte settled 260 million rand it paid, and that was it. No more liability. Is that fair?
I don't think it's fair, but it's also, I think, important to note that the company spent a couple of $100 million on an investigation by PwC, funded by the company's money, and we've never seen that report. A bit like what happened with Steinhoff, and eventually that was a matter that went to a big pie application, and they won and got that report released. But this is, again, another issue here, that the very people who investigated all these problems then delivered their report, and using fancy legal maneuvers were able to not prevent that report from becoming public. So we don't know exactly what failures existed, and we should know. It's a public interest issue, in my opinion. We can't learn from these issues, but more importantly, we can't hold accountability. I actually ended up having an interview by the Hawks recently, and they, after 6.5 years, they invited me to come and share my thoughts with them, which was a bit strange. And my comment to them largely was, look, I only have hearsay. We've never been given the facts. We've never been shown the report. And the argument always is they need the report to protect their cases against these individuals, which is a nonsense, really, because you have to share evidence with all parties. So I don't know. It's just very, very frustrating that I estimate that we have spent, Tongaat has spent over R1 billion, and that's not a hyperbole or exaggeration. They've spent over R1 billion in professional fees since this debacle started, over R1 billion. Now, for a company that is over indebted and can't survive and is now going to be liquidated, that's one of the tragedies of this thing. A lot of people have got rich. A lot of people have made money, and I think that's just, again, indicative of the system we have in South Africa.
Business Rescue, 37 months. Every month they produced a report, and now finally they've thrown in the towel. Is that presumably part of that R1 billion that was received by professionals?
Yeah, it's certainly a big chunk of it. We don't know the exact breakdowns, but we can piece together a bunch of stuff from when financials were disclosed. Remember, they stopped disclosing financials in 22. Again, we believe unlawfully. We believe they were hiding behind ridiculous arguments, but they in breach of the Companies Act in so many ways. But accountability for your actions is one of the cornerstones of governance. And we don't know the exact numbers, but I can tell you I've done enough research and I've confirmed with parties there to say, well, this is the number that I'm not overstating. But yeah, the BRPs, PwC, the auditors continue to audit a company which is now not auditable. Let's put that in perspective. Every year they've been auditing the company and failing to produce an audit report because they say they can't finish the audit report. Well, why are we doing an audit then? It's just an absurdity. Lawyers, just absolute extraordinary number of people who have been feeding at the trough of this tragic situation.
It's almost like the vultures are the ones who get fattest in these corporate disasters, similar with Steinhoff. I recall the chief executive lawyers who took over at Steinhoff, and they were very handsomely rewarded for their time at that company. There does seem to be something a little weird there. But let's go back to Ground Zero and the Steinhoff executives, the Tongaat Hulett executives, who did have a day in court, but nothing much seems to have happened. Now we as outsiders would only notice what's going on when it hits the news, when the guys go to court. You've been following it a lot more closely. What is happening to those executives led by Peter Stader?
Well, the matter's sitting in the hands of the National Prosecuting Authority. The Hawks, I guess you could broadly, the Directorate of, let's just call it the Hawks, broadly known as the Hawks. And there's a team of advocates, a team of people that have been investigating this thing for 6 years now. And as I say, I attended a meeting voluntarily at their request, and I went and gave them what I knew and gave them a timeline. And I said, look, it's really hard to even remember this stuff. It's 6.5 years ago. But I don't know. It just seems like a lack of. I mean, it's part of a bigger problem. I mean, how many white collar crimes have been prosecuted in South Africa? A very, very few. You'd be not too far wrong to say none. And we've had commission of inquiry after commission of inquiry. We've had corporate frauds. Yes, a couple of people from Steinhoff were prosecuted, but at the end of the day, there's such a long queue to the court. I don't know how they're ever going to get through them.
Yet we have the King Code, and we have all these wonderful processes that we're supposed to be, that boards are supposed to go through. You have the compliance regulations, which throttle companies' processes as well. So it seems like something's gone really wrong here, Dave.
Look, I think it was very important to create frameworks for governance, but like everything and laws and rules and all those things, but like everything in life, if you don't enforce them well, and you don't hold people accountable, and you don't make examples of people who don't, then regulation is only for those who want to be regulated or who accept that being regulated is a good thing. So I'm involved in companies where honestly I can say we go to the absolute nth degree to comply, explain, and disclose everything that we feel is right and proper. And those frameworks are very good, but they're only good for the people who accept them and want to follow them.
Okay, so what's going to happen to Stader & Co., given that it's taken 6.5 years already, and a key source of information, yourself, has only now been brought into, or how long ago was this? Was this after the previous head of National Prosecuting Authority, Shamila Batoy, had departed the scene?
No, it was late last year, so November last year. But honestly, I think it's an exaggeration to say that I am key. I mean, I was, to a large extent, using public information, which was unverified. It led to a cascading effect. But the real information is what was in the records in the company. I've never been allowed to verify, check. What we know is what was disclosed and all the things that came from it. But the real evidence lies within the company with the executives and with the PwC report. I don't know what's going to happen. All I know is that time is your enemy on these things. We saw with people like Gary Porritt. I mean, there's like decades eventually before justice is not served over a long period of time. It decays over time. So I'm not hopeful that, and I'm not even focused on that. I don't think anything much will come of it.
Gary Porritt, another KZN boy, and his company was Tygon, very well remembered by those who were around at the time. So we've had the big three now: Tygon, Steinhoff, Tongaat Hulett. Why I suggested that you were key was if the Hawks had said, okay, this is an area of great complexity. Who's a guy that would be able to ask the right questions and point us in the right direction? I think that would be clearly you'd be able to help them a great deal. So from what you've told us, then those Tongaat Hulett executives are still living normal lives. They will still have their day in court. Perhaps they will be able to offer a defense of some sort that will exonerate them.
We know that their defenses could be very technical. There's very complex elements of law. I think if you were to, use the court of public opinion, at least Peter Stoudy and some of the players, and certainly the guy who ran property, they committed fraud. No other way to put it. And I guess they could come and sue me for libel for that. But the reality is that there was fraud. There were transactions entered into that were fictitious. They're property transactions. There were transactions that were manipulated where they lent deposits to people to buy properties. I mean, that's just ridiculous. And there was, overstatement of profits and understatement of expenses, the capitalizing of expenses that were not assets. There's no other way to put this other than it was fraud, and the outcome was obvious. Company failed. The legal arguments are going to take up a lot of time and cost a lot of money.
There were some pretty useful guys who were brought in to try and fix things, including an ex-CEO of SAB Miller's beer division here in South Africa. He didn't have much success. Why do you think that is?
Alec, it's a long conversation. I think there were a number of things working against him, and there were various situations that occurred in the economy, the riots, the floods, the COVID. But I also think there was a level of arrogance that was like, well, the new broom can sweep out the old and we can fix it all. And we will be the Superman that comes swooping in and fix it. It was very complicated. And from the start, they made some big mistakes. They didn't realize fully that Tongaat's an operating business and it's run by engineers, and the mills are dirty, complex places. And I don't think they really understood that. They tried to play corporate games. They put consultants in, but I almost thought it's kind of a piece of the history. It was just a failed step that didn't lead to anything. What really I think was problematic is that the lack of trust, the trust that broke down between the bankers, the various parties, the business. There was always an overly optimistic view being presented, and eventually the banks just drew a line and said enough.
How much did the banks lose in all this?
It's a good question. So how much capital did they lose? How much interest have they accumulated? So if you go back to the original debt, it was about 11 billion, 12 billion. They sold starch, they sold Namibia. They actually did a pretty good job at raising about 6 billion of cash, and they paid down the debt to about 5.5 billion in 21. But the bankers weren't happy, and rightly so. I guess they were saying, listen, you promised an 8 billion reduction in debt, you didn't make it. So the screws got put on. Default interest rates were put in place, 20% interest rates. So this debt has been growing at 20% per annum interest rates, the likes of micro lending and unsecured lending. And it is now accumulated to 11.7 billion. No further grants of loans, no payments back. It's just a ballooning. So you've got about 6 billion has doubled to 12. Has the 6 billion of interest that has been suspended rightfully owed to the lenders, in this case now Vision? I don't believe so. I believe there should have been a suspension of that debt. I think the banks could have and should have done a haircut on that debt, and that would have allowed all parties to come into the room and see that the sledgehammer hanging over the company had been somewhat taken away. No equity provider was going to put money into the company while there's 11 billion of debt hanging over their heads. And so this was a stalemate caused by, to a large extent, the inability to just accept reality. In the end, the bank sold that debt for 3.2 billion. And there's another interesting twist in the tale on that piece, but we can get to that.
No, tell us now.
Okay, so what happened in the business rescue process, that ordinarily business rescue step in, they organize a process by which people are invited to come in and make bids, or strategic equity partners. But Vision did something clever, if you in a kind of that mindset. They didn't come in and put a bid to the business rescue practitioners. They actually went and bought the loan claims from the banks. But they bought them in paper only. They didn't actually pay for them. They bought them. They said they paid for them. They didn't. They actually bought them in a contract to be funded at some future date. They then went to the business rescue practitioners and said, we own the debt now, we control the process. So they forced all of the other bidders out of the room and essentially got themselves, and I know I'm going to probably be said that I'm missing some important parts, but they're not that important. At the end of the day, they got themselves in a position where they were the only party as both the lender and the strategic rescuer for the company. All they really offered on the rescue was, we'll take over, we own the debt, we'll put in 75 million for the creditors, we'll put 517 million into an escrow fund to settle SASSA if we lose our claim against them, which they've tried very hard to wangle out of. And that was it, pretty much. So there was no injection of equity into this company. The company's failed because it's over indebted. It's insolvent. So this is all about playing with who owns the debt, who's going to control the debt. They then tried to convert a portion of that debt to get rid of the shareholders. But we legitimately said, you do not own this debt. You have bought it, but you don't own it. There's a very big difference. If you contract to buy something, you only own it when you settle the purchase price. They didn't do that. We voted no. They were very, very upset with us. Had meetings with some of the members there, and they were very angry with me. And luckily, I've got a thick skin. But it became very ugly, and they were like, well, you're destroying the company and the like. But we said, look, you can't use your debt as currency when you don't own it. That's just fact. Anyway, walk forward another year. They eventually claimed that they'd paid for the debt. So they'd reduced the purchase price from 3.6 to 3.2. The reality, though, is they never really paid for that debt. What they actually did is manage to get Standard Bank and the IDC to essentially fund their own acquisition of the debt that now essentially Standard Bank and the IDC were the biggest creditors in. So what we kind of did was move them back a step. We moved them a couple of rows back in this grandstand. Vision had still not really put any money in. We understand now that they did put 1.5 billion in. However, we still do not know where that 1.5 billion, and I'm pretty confident to say, did not come from the parties, the Vision parties. It came from a third source. There's speculation about who that is, and I won't, muddy the water with unverified speculation. But they did not put their own money in. So what they've done essentially is a kind of corporate hijacking, using everyone else's money to gain control of the company, and then they started to tighten the screws on the company. So we saw the IDC, who had put in 2.3 billion of emergency funding into Tongaat, starting to have lots of demands placed on them. Demands including, you must fund us. And that, if you look at the papers that were submitted to court last week, an extraordinary tale of lawyers, letters, and communication between the IDC, Vision, and what it ended up was they needed another 600 million rand because they ran out of money. Vision said to the IDC, you must put the money in. The IDC said, not such a hurry. We already got a lot of debt here, and we've got the smallest piece of the security pool. So they came back and said, well, we'll put in half if you put in half. Not an unreasonable request, quite frankly. I thought that was quite a clever move by them. Look, it took a long, long time to get to that, and a lot of people sitting on their hands. But at the end of the day, IDC said, we'll put in half if you put in half. Vision said no. They then started making some really outrageous demands using leverage, and eventually said, well, Standard Bank must put in the share. We're not putting it in. So then the papers turned into, well, IDC and Standard Bank will put up the money. And that's when I started to get a bit cold, because I'm realizing this is now capture. And eventually I think the IDC just said, no, enough's enough. They tried to get the African subsidiaries sold out unconditionally pre the business rescue plan implementation. And I give credit to the BRPs. They did not move on that line. And I saw some very aggressive emails and some very aggressive WhatsApps, which, it's just wrong. So at the end of the day, what we have is we have Vision, who have bought all the debts, 11 billion, of which half is just accrued interest. They haven't really paid for it. They're using their muscle to now capture the company, and everybody will lose. SASA is never going to see their money in this scenario. The industry is going to be pitted against each other. And sadly, I think it's an industry that cannot be run by corporate raiders. That's what it's come to.
Who is Vision? You've mentioned the name a few times.
Yeah. So Vision is a consortium of 4 primary people. There are probably some other people that are undisclosed we don't know about, but it's when it was constructed, the company Vision 155 Investments was created at SPV. It was the principals to that were a Zimbabwean gentleman, Ruti Moyo. I'm using the sort of abbreviated names. He actually sits on the HIPPO board in Tongaat, in Zimbabwe, which is part of the Tongaat group.
That's that really, really exciting sugar prospect in Zimbabwe. Probably the best asset there.
Yeah, Triangle and HIPPO are some of the best sugar estates in the world. And so he comes from Zimbabwe. He has a connection to the group through HIPPO. We have Robert Gomedi, who's well known in South Africa. He is a member of that consortium. We have, I just want to make sure I get the names right, Nauman Khan, who actually represents a Pakistani company, Al Moyez, very, very good sugar company in Pakistan. So they kind of were the technical parties to this, and they have actually done some very good work advising and helping with production. And then the last person is Amri Yunus, well-known person in South Africa. He represented originally a company called Terrace, which was the first bidder, and then it evolved into Vision. So 4 big players, lots of talk about other people in the background, but again, I'm not going to speculate on things that aren't proven. What is interesting, though, is that what you would have thought, if they didn't bring money to the table, they brought value, and you would have thought they'd share that roughly 25, 25, 25, 25, or something in that order. It turns out Ruti Moyo actually is 60% of the consortium. Now, he's, without a doubt in my mind, the least powerful person in the group, but he does bring something very important, is possibly money and people from Zimbabwe.
So what happens now to the Zimbabwean asset that we mentioned a moment ago?
Zimbabwe and Mozambique are the 2 main African operations. Both have their own problems right now, socio-political problems. Mozambique caught up with the floods. But at the end of the day, they're very good assets, and they will be restored. But they have been mired in problems of fraud and corruption, absolutely endemic, and political interference, and just no leadership. So I still believe these 2 assets are worth north of 200 to 250 million US dollars. And even at the weaker rand right now, it's still more than the 3.2 billion that was paid for all the claims. So I do think that, this has been a kind of stealth capture, which is very sad for the players who are going to lose and the farmers.
And the South African, exactly, that's the next question. The South African operations, the farmers in this country, those who had an exposure to Tongaat Hulett, what happens to them?
Well, the sugar industry is an extraordinarily integrated industry. It's integrated in a value chain, and that's why we have the Sugar Act and the sugar industry agreement, because at the end of the day, you have a whole lot of cane being grown, ultimately gets crushed, gets made into raw sugar, then gets refined into refined or commercial grade sugar and sold. And some of it's sold locally, about 2/3 to 3/4, and the rest is sold internationally. And it's all governed under SASA and the Act, the Sugar Act, and the master plan. But essentially what happens is everything is pooled, and then everyone gets a share of the pie between the millers and the growers, and between the millers and the millers, and between the refiners. The problem with all of those is whenever you have a formula that dictates how value should be shared, people spend more time trying to arbitrage and think how they can steal a bit more than they are entitled to, because that's all they can gain. The business rescue practitioners, I believe, made an absolutely fatal mistake by going to court to fight the SASA levies that were due and payable at the time of business rescue, 500 odd million. Bear in mind that these are statutory payments under law. They ordinarily are not capable of being suspended, but more importantly, they bit the hand that feeds them. the industry operates in a collaborative way. So all that it did was lay down a gauntlet, and everybody has responded. And that's why I believe we've seen imports from Eswatini uncontrolled. Everybody is, I think, in a way, what they did is they declared war, and then everyone now is playing war, which is the worst outcome for the industry. I personally believe the regulations are a problem. I think the arguments put forward by business rescue practitioners and even Vision are merit. They have merit, but you have to negotiate change from a place of good relationships. You can't start negotiations when you're firing rockets at each other. So I think what happened here is that the failure to resolve the industry issues was triggered by the adversarial effect of that case, which they lost, and then they still went and lodged a constitutional court appeal a week before liquidation. The end result, though, I believe the industry should deregulate, but we should put closer ties between the millers and the growers in each region. In other words, almost to create a set of mini cooperative structures where each farmer group that feeds a mill is bound by an agreement on how they share the value of the cane and the sugar that comes from the mill. Everything else is really, in a way, it's just caused chaos in the process.
Well, chaos is a very good word when you think of Tongaat Hulett nowadays. There are a few things that are really standing out here. The whole Vision consortium, as you've outlined, are sharp operators, and they've been looking to use other people's money to get the best advantage of an asset. So that's the first part of it. The people who caused the trouble in the first place, the executives, have still not been brought to account. So they're sitting out there, and the business rescue process continued for more than 3 years, with the practitioners being well paid and no bottom line improvement. And of course, on top of all of this, you got the National Prosecuting Authority, who have not applied anything yet. Let's hope that that's still coming around the corner, because the South African corporate reputation requires it. But what about something very, very close to the hearts of many people in KZN, those who live in Mount Edgecombe? Mount Edgecombe is a high-end estate. Properties there are very valuable, a couple of golf courses, and it's owned by Tongaat Hulett. So what happens there, Dave? To the what? Do you have any good news for the people who live on those estates?
Well, the good news is that actually that Tongaat don't own Mount Edgecombe, and what Tongaat Hulett's development did was they created develops initially on a very integrated basis. So Mount Edgecombe was fully developed by Tongaat. But ultimately, it was converted into a township under town planning rules. A homeowners organization created, a non-profit, and all the properties then became freehold. So the common areas are owned by the HOA. It's pretty much like every estate in South Africa, where I live here in Zimbali and Valdivia and all the rest, Daneford. It no longer has any influence from Tongaat. Yes, it was created by, as was Zimbali, as was Zimbali Lakes. So yes, the legacy of Tongaat Hulett developments, the whole of Gateway, the whole of Mshanga Ridge development, are incredible vision that took place at the time that saw the North Coast corridor opening up and developing. But Tongaat, sadly, right now has neither ownership of any of those land assets, and they started selling land wholesale. So they sold vast tracts of land undeveloped to developers who are now developing. So Sabaya and some of the other areas around the Dubai trade port. So they lost the value of the developments by just selling wholesale land because they were desperate for money. The bigger risk at the moment is that the entire North Coast from, say, Tongaat North to Impangeni is almost entirely farming, sugar farming, some plantations, a little bit of expansion into macadamias and the like. But there's not much industry up there. It's very, very dependent. About 1 million livelihoods are sustained, and there are lots of numbers that throw around. But just to put one number into context, the crop this year that the farmers will sell to Tongaat, the milling season starts in end of March, goes to middle of December, is around 4.5 billion rand. So that's the farmer's share of the 500,000 tons of sugar that will be then split roughly 60 to two-thirds, one-third with the farmers. So the farmers will get 4.5 billion depending on the price of sugar. Now, if you take that 4.5 billion rand away, and this cane has got no value other than being crushed into sugar, that will decimate the North Coast in the true meaning of the word, not the over-exaggerated version. I think the banks have got multiple billions of exposure. So I guess my last comment to you is a plea that everybody kind of calms down, that the IDC, I think, have got a critical role to play in bridging jobs and industries that are in trouble. That's their key role, and I value and respect that. I think the farmers and SASSA need to really now come back to the table in a spirit of how do we fix this problem? And I would actually put a plea out to the banks to come back in and intervene on this process, because I think if this goes down the road it's going down, there will be far greater losses, huge economic impact for the North Coast. I think Vision will most likely look at Zimbabwe and Mozambique as their golden geese, and the losses to the banks could run into many, many more billions. So I guess my plea is that everybody comes to the table and puts their egos aside and puts all their interests aside and looks for the farmers who have had a very tough time in the last few years.
Belated acquisition of some humility. But Dave, the golf courses at Mount Edgecombe, there are 2 golf courses. Are they not owned by Tongaat Hulett?
No, they're owned by, so Mekama. I actually lived at Mount Edgecombe when I first came back to South Africa. So I just happen to know that the Mekama is the Mount Edgecombe something Owners Association. It's a non-profit entity set up in terms of how these township developments are established, where there's a master property layout approved by the developers, and then those parts that are common interest, like the golf course or the roads and the infrastructure, are all held under the homeowners body, and the actual properties are all individual earths or sectional title schemes. So, it's synonymous with Tongaat, and it always was for many years. It was the Tongaat golf course, and they converted it into an estate, and they did a fabulous job with that, and it's a wonderful place to live and exist.
Thank you for that. We've had quite a lot of concerned residents who are not as well informed as you are, and are worried that the golf courses could now be sold to a Vision type operation who would convert it into housing, etc. But that's pretty safe on that side.
I think they can sleep better at night about that. That's not going to happen.
And just the future. How are you seeing this all play out? You have explained that a dollop of humility is required to get some kind of a future that will be preferable to people. But if that doesn't happen, will the Zimbabwean and Mozambican assets then end up with the opportunists at Vision, and the assets on the north coast of KZN end up in a parlous state?
I think I'm going to be very careful here, because I don't want to confuse to say that Vision are bad owners of these assets. They just haven't proven their ability to provide funding and a whole lot of actions that I think don't really give them credit or haven't shown them to be responsible corporate citizens in this process. So I'm doubtful about the way that they could play in saving an industry as opposed to saving or getting a return on investment. But at the end of the day, these are very important businesses that will be saved. I have absolutely no doubt that the farmers won't plow back 5 million tons of cane this season. Sadly, right now, anyone who wishes to go, and if you can get in and have a look, the mills are in probably 10,000 pieces. They're in the process of the annual maintenance process of stripping, fixing, putting it all back together. It's a very, very tough process. They're all over the floor. The mills are inoperable right now. Now, it requires very good engineers, very dedicated staff to put it all back together, get it ready for the beginning of the season. But I think at the end of the day, there's just too much at risk. And even though we seem to go to the edge of the abyss in this country many, many times over, we somehow pull it back at the last second. We seem to have this tendency in South Africa to let a crisis become a catastrophe, and then somehow we pull ourselves back from the abyss. I'm just hopeful that we can do the same here, and that calm minds will somehow get. I do think the DTIC have got a really important role to play here, and somehow we've got to get everyone just thinking about South Africa first, not themselves.
And SASA being the South African Sugar Association, not to be confused with the social welfare operation in this country at all.
No, that's got an extra S in it. Yeah, SASA 1S, 2 SASA. They're a regulatory body actually given constitutional rights under the Sugar Act. Well, the constitution of SASA is protected under the Sugar Act. So they are an organ of the state, so to speak, and that they are empowered to regulate the industry.
And the Vision Consortium hopefully will step up and show themselves not to be opportunists and actually to be people who do have a long-term future in mind for the industry as a whole. Dave Woollam, thanks for sharing insights with us today. It's a complicated story, but it's one that you've walked with us for some years now. As I think you've concluded, or we would conclude from this discussion, the end it's not the end of the story by any means, but it certainly is at least maybe the beginning of the end. Let's hope that the calmer minds, as you've said, do prevail. Dave Woollam is a financial analyst, former financial director of a bank, chartered accountant, and he's has a close family interest, as you heard, in the Tongaat Hulett saga. I'm Alec Hogg from biznews.com.